Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on fracking with forever chemicals in West Virginia. Normally we do these in afternoon or evening, but it's nice to have a lunchtime webinar if you're on the East Coast, or if you're coming in from the West Coast, it's closer to breakfast, but appreciate all y'all joining us today for this presentation. My name is Kevin Richardson. I'm with Halt the Harm Network. We're co-hosting this event with West Virginia Rivers and Physicians for Social Responsibility, or PSR as we normally call them. We're really excited for this event. This coincides with the release of the report on fracking with PFAS, or quote unquote forever chemicals in West Virginia, which is a really important report that we're happy to share with you all today. You'll hear from some of the report's authors about what's in it, and we'll also hear from West Virginia Rivers about the impacts and what you can do with it. I'm just here to welcome you guys, and I'm also your technical support. So if you have any issues with a Zoom call or any problems, feel free to send me a direct message in the chat, and I can help you out with it. You can find me under Kevin Richardson in the chat. Before we get started, I just want to have a quick word about Halt the Harm Network since we're helping to host this. Halt the Harm Network is a grassroots organization. We have leaders, supporters, and activists from across the country who are fighting oil and gas harms. We exist as a network that has an online community, which you can see a screenshot of right here. It's a place where you can connect with other advocates, organizers, or experts who are working to protect their communities from oil and gas harms. We have the private network, and I'll drop a link to join that in just a second. We also host webinars like this, as well as doing campaign support for any local or nationwide actions that people involved in the movement to fight the harms of oil and gas are leading or participating in. We're always happy to share actions and help folks when they're getting started, when they're fully into campaigning, or if they've been campaigning for a long time. We can help you out with digital campaign, connecting to experts and things like that. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat, and as well as a link to sign up for West Virginia Rivers. And I hope y'all are, and hope y'all are already following West Virginia Rivers, PSR, and Halt the Harm. But if you're not, I'd encourage you guys to join that. I'm going to stop sharing our screen, and I'll get into our main event and introduce our first speaker tonight. We're going to have quite a few speakers, and then we're going to have a Q&A afterwards. Just a word on the Q&A. We're going to ask folks to go ahead and drop your questions in the chat as we go along. And once we get to Q&A, we'll cycle through those questions and address them afterwards. We should have a good amount of time, so I encourage y'all to drop as many questions as you can in the chat. Don't hesitate to ask anything about this. It's a really important topic, and we'd love to answer your questions on it. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Barb Gottlieb, who's the director of the Environmental and Health Program at Physicians for Social Responsibility. She develops their education advocacy programs on climate and energy and works with their local chapters and members to promote policies that will secure a cleaner, healthier nation and livable climate. She is also the author or co-author of PSR's major reports on health implications of fossil fuels, including fracked gas, hydrogen, coal ash, and the latest series of reports on PFAS chemicals and oil and gas extraction, which is what today's event is about. And I'm sure you've seen some of the more recent reports on Pennsylvania and other places. Prior to working at PSR, Barb worked as an organizer, advocate, fundraiser, and communications specialist in the nonprofit sector. She also lived in Guatemala for 5 years, where she worked for indigenous organizations, raising funds, providing trainings on community-led sustainable development in war-ravaged areas. Really happy to have Barb here. She's going to lead us in, introduce our speakers, and then she'll also come back for the Q&A and help organize that. So with that, I'll pass it to Barb, and thanks everyone for coming today.
Well, thank you, Kevin. It's really great to be here, and I'm very pleased to be back with the Halt the Harm Network. As Kevin mentioned, I'm Barb Gottlieb, the director of the Environment and Health Program in the National Office of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I'm the co-author of the report we'll be hearing about today. So I hope everybody's had a chance to download the report. If you haven't, it's available now on the PSR website at www.psr.org. We have an easy one there. This is the 6th in our series of reports looking at different states across the country and the oil and gas industry's use of PFAS in those states. What we found in all of these states raises really deep concerns for the health of people wherever those chemicals are used. And we have a great lineup of speakers today to tell you more about PFAS, specifically in West Virginia gas wells and what you can do about it. So in the order in which they'll be speaking, let me tell you just who's coming up. First, my colleague and the lead researcher and author of today's report, Dusty Horwitz. Dusty has spent nearly 20 years researching and working to protect communities from the health and environmental impacts of oil and gas drilling and fracking, as well as other environmental risks. An attorney and a former reporter, he has authored or co-authored PSR's reports on the use of PFAS, as I mentioned. In 2022, he was invited to testify before the Colorado House of Representatives and State Senate regarding legislation which was later passed into law that banned the use of PFAS in oil and gas wells in Colorado and improved oil and gas chemical disclosures in that state. Again, he's the lead author of today's report, Fracking with Forever Chemicals in West Virginia. Following Dusty, our second speaker will be Linda Aller. Linda is a hydrogeologist based across the river from West Virginia in Westerville, Ohio. She has been consulting on PFAS issues since 2002. Among other activities, she helped the Little Hocking Water Association in Little Hocking, Ohio, with a water system serving 10,000 people, address PFAS pollution from the factory across the river near Parkersburg, West Virginia, that was previously operated by DuPont and now run by Chemours. After Linda, we'll hear from Jill Hunkler. Jill is a mother, teacher, artist, grassroots organizer, and the founder of Ohio Valley Allies, community and environmental advocacy organization. She's a 7th generation Ohio Valley resident in Belmont County, the most heavily fracked county in the state of Ohio. Due to the vast oil and gas infrastructure that polluted her country home in Slope Creek Valley, she experienced negative health impacts and was forced to relocate. She educates the public about the threats we face due to the polluting and poorly regulated oil and gas and petrochemical industries. And she has helped empower people in Ohio, in West Virginia, and beyond to stand up for their rights for a healthy environment. Rounding up our lineup of expert speakers is Jenna Dodson. She's the staff scientist at West Virginia Rivers Coalition, our partner on this presentation today. She coordinates a variety of source water and policy programs and manages the West Virginia Water Quality Monitoring Project. She's passionate about connecting science, policy, and community engagement, and helped garner the grassroots support needed to pass the PFAS Protection Act. Before we start, I want to add just one observation that you won't find in the report. In the Washington Post about a week and a half ago, there was an article. It was an article actually about the cancer diagnosis of Catherine, Princess of Wales, not the subject of today's presentation. But I read this statement that was, I thought, very troubling. It said, and I quote, "The global incidence of cancers among younger people increased by nearly 80% between 1990 and 2019, according to a study published in BMJ Oncology. In the United States, one study by American Cancer Society researchers found that detections of 6 of 12 cancers related to obesity jumped significantly in young adults." ... The article went on to say, experts are not sure why cancer has increased among young people, but speculate that obesity, alcohol, smoking, and lifestyle may play a role, as well as exposure to pollutants and harmful chemicals. So why am I saying this today? Let me be very clear. I'm not saying that PFAS chemicals cause this significant rise in cancer. First of all, we don't know that. Second of all, there are many causes of cancer. But what I do want to say is that among the many causes of cancer, PFAS are high on the list. They are carcinogenic. Once in the atmosphere, they basically don't break down, which is why they're called forever chemicals. They're found across the country. They're found in the bodies of most people in this country. And their use in drilling and fracking contributes to the cumulative threat of exposure to carcinogens. So I just urge you to bear that level of danger in mind as you hear from our speakers today about the industry's use of these dangerous chemicals in West Virginia's horizontal gas wells. I'll turn the mic over now to Dusty Horwitz. Dusty?
Thanks so much, Barb. I'm going to share my screen so that we can see some pages from our report. I'm going to give an overview of our report. Can everyone see that?
Looks great.
Great. I'm going to give an overview of our report and talk about why we're so concerned about the use of PFAS in horizontal gas wells in West Virginia and all oil and gas wells in West Virginia. PFAS have been used in our economy widely for decades, since the 1940s. They have several valuable properties. They're oil resistant, water resistant. They are excellent lubricants. They can create foams. And so as a result, they have been used in many different applications, perhaps the most famous of which are nonstick pots and pans. However, PFAS also have multiple very negative qualities, and some of them are on this slide. Whoops, sorry, I'm trying to advance. There we go. They don't break down in the environment. They're toxic at microscopic concentrations. They spread easily in water, and they are linked to multiple negative health impacts. To give you a sense of how toxic PFAS can be, we calculated that at the levels that EPA recently set for a type of PFAS called PFOA in drinking water, or I should say at the levels EPA proposed to regulate PFOA in drinking water, 1 cup of PFOA would be enough to contaminate about 28 billion gallons of water, which is around 3 times the amount of water used by the city of Charleston over the course of a year. So these chemicals can be very, very toxic. They also are associated with multiple negative health impacts, including increased cholesterol levels, low birth weight in babies, increased risk of testicular cancer in men, increased risk of kidney cancer in both men and women, increased risk of high blood pressure in pregnant women, and decreased vaccine response in both women and men, which of course is a major concern in the age of COVID. Low birth weight in babies, I want to emphasize, is a leading contributor to infant death in the United States. It's a very serious health impact. We've seen some of these health impacts in studies of populations of people living near oil and gas wells. Researchers have found a higher incidence of low birth weight babies, a higher incidence of heart disease, which could be linked to high cholesterol levels. We don't know if any of these health impacts are associated with PFAS exposure, but we are concerned and would like to see more research on that front. We know that PFAS pollution is already a problem in West Virginia. This is a map published in 2022 by the U.S. Geological Survey based on testing that they did of raw water sources for public water supplies in West Virginia. The black triangles on the map show locations where U.S. Geological Survey found PFAS pollution in surface water supplies, and the black circles on the map, some of which are down here at the southern end of the state, show places where U.S. Geological Survey found PFAS pollution in groundwater. They did not determine that these sites were necessarily related to oil and gas operations, or the pollution was related to oil and gas operations, but they did find PFAS pollution throughout the state. This even more recent study, published in November 2023, did find a link between water pollution in West Virginia in private water supplies and oil and gas operations. In most cases, the researchers found an association, but they could not be confident about causation. But in the case of 3 private water wells, they all but concluded that the oil and gas operations nearby caused pollution in those water wells with PFAS. And there could be multiple mechanisms for that pollution. The researchers did not go into that, but I will share a number of pathways through which PFAS and other dangerous chemicals used in oil and gas operations could get into groundwater or otherwise pollute the environment and cause exposure to people. This is a picture of the underground portion of an oil and gas well published by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. When a well is first drilled, the companies start up here at the surface, and they bore straight down through the earth and rock, creating an open hole. In this process, they go right through the groundwater, which is represented in this slide by these horizontal blue swaths. And if they're using chemicals in that drilling process, which they often do, and there is evidence that they have used PFAS in drilling, those chemicals can get right into the groundwater. So that's one potential pathway of pollution. Then once that hole is drilled, they insert in the middle of the hole steel casing, a cylindrical steel tube, which is represented by this bluish tube in this diagram. Once that's installed, they inject cement down the middle of that tube. The cement hits the bottom of the well and then fills up all the way to the surface alongside of that tube. And that's represented by the gray material here. What their hope is that that's going to create an impermeable seal between the well and the groundwater. But as this slide demonstrates, that doesn't always happen. There can be leaks and cracks in the casing, gaps between the casing and the cement, and that's what these 5 close-ups illustrate. And so that's another pathway of possible pollution. And the part of the process in which this type of leak in the well may be of highest concern is hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Here you can see what a fracking operation looks like on the surface in West Virginia. There are a lot of trucks. There are tanks usually on site. The process involves injecting into oil and gas wells millions of gallons of water mixed with sand and chemicals, some of which we know are PFAS. They are put into the well at high pressure. They fracture the formation underground. And then after fracking is complete, a portion of that fluid comes back up to the surface in the form of wastewater, along with naturally occurring water in the formation that can contain its own contaminants. And that fluid can leak, it can spill, seeping into the groundwater. It's typically taken to deep underground injection wells where it's re-injected supposedly for permanent disposal, but those wells have been known to leak and contaminate groundwater too. There can also be airborne emissions at these wells. Here's another photo of a well site in West Virginia. You can see how close this is to water. This is in Marshall County, West Virginia. And so if you have a leak or a spill at a site like this, it could easily get into the surface water. And as I mentioned, the leaks can also get into groundwater. In our report, we focused not only on these impacts of PFAS and pathways, but we also looked at disclosures of hydraulic fracturing chemicals in West Virginia used at horizontal gas well sites. Under West Virginia law, companies are required to make these disclosures of fracking chemicals used in horizontal gas wells. What we found is that companies had used PFAS, a form of PFAS called PTFE or Teflon, at 43 sites over a 10-year period, 2013 to 2022. Those are represented on this map, which was created by Frack Tracker Alliance, which did an outstanding job on the maps in our reports. These maps are depicted with the red dots, and they're almost all in northern West Virginia. We also found that companies injected more than 1,900 horizontal gas wells over the last 10 years or so, chemicals whose identities have been withheld from the public under trade secret claims, which is allowed under West Virginia law. That's a very unfortunate gap in disclosure under the law that puts people in an unfair situation of potentially being unknowingly exposed to PFAS or other dangerous chemicals. Those dots where the trade secret chemicals were used are represented in blue and gold. The blue dots represent wells where trade secret surfactants were used, a class of chemicals that includes a subclass called fluorosurfactants that are often PFAS, and the gold dots are trade secret chemicals of some kind, which could be PFAS. This table shows county by county where the wells, the horizontal gas wells, are located that were injected with PTFE or Teflon. You can see there are 8 counties here: Brooke, Doddridge, Marion, Marshall, Monongalia, Ohio, Tyler, and Wetzel. The total mass of this PFAS was 602 pounds. And over on the right, you can see the companies that injected these chemicals. But as I suggested earlier, these 43 wells may not be the total extent of, or may not represent the total extent of PFAS use in fracking operations or other oil and gas operations in West Virginia. And here you can see a table showing the distribution county by county of the horizontal gas wells where companies injected at least one trade secret chemical that could be PFAS. There were more than 20 counties where this occurred, and these chemicals totaled a staggering almost 70 million pounds. If only a fraction of that total were PFAS, that could be an enormous amount of PFAS potentially going into the environment. And then almost 400 wells were injected with trade secret surfactants, which could be fluorosurfactants that are often PFAS. These 4 scientific papers suggest that the trade secret chemicals could be PFAS. They talk about how PFAS chemicals are routinely used in oil and gas operations, and there's evidence that these chemicals have been used in oil and gas operations going back as early as the 1950s or 60s. This table shows a few examples of individual wells that were injected in West Virginia with PFAS or trade secret chemicals. You can see this this one here, the 4th one down, was operated by JB Oil and Gas Incorporated in Pleasants County, West Virginia. It was fracked in 2018 with a non-ionic surfactant. Its identity is proprietary or trade secret, and more than 2,700 pounds of this chemical were injected just into one well, which could be a lot if that is a PFAS. Our report also features interactive maps, also created by Frack Tracker, that allow users to zoom in to see where these wells were located in your communities. You can see Wheeling, West Virginia here in the lower left-hand corner. If you go about 5 miles east, you see this well, a red dot on the map, which indicates it was injected with PTFE or Teflon. And if you click on these wells, a little information window pops up. And one of the important pieces of information here is an API number, which is a unique numeric identifier assigned to each oil and gas well. You can use that information to then go to the Frack Focus website, which is the repository of hydraulic fracturing chemical disclosure for horizontal gas wells in West Virginia. And you can find this original hydraulic fracturing chemical disclosure form using this API number here. And if you go to the second page of the form, you see here that the company injected this well with PTFE or Teflon. A little bit lower, you can see one trade secret chemical here and another one here. And so these chemicals, the use of these chemicals in these wells is of great concern because of their significant health impacts and the potential significant health impacts of trade secret chemicals whose identities we don't know, and the potential that these chemicals could be PFAS and not break down in the environment. There are a few recommendations we have at the end of our report, but I'm going to pause here and talk about those recommendations a little bit later and give our next speaker a chance to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dusty. That was a great summary, I think, of the pathways to the process of fracking, the pathways to exposure that may allow these dangerous chemicals to escape into the environment, and then the specific findings in our report, as well as these maps that anybody who downloads the report can use to check out maps in their area. We're going to hear next from Linda Aller. Again, she's a hydrogeologist, and we'll be talking about what can we do to protect ourselves from forever chemicals in our water sources. Linda?
Hi, thanks so much. I'm going to also be sharing my screen here. So as soon as I am up, there we are. So I've been asked to kind of talk to you as a general person, what can you do? And the reason that you should be concerned about PFAS chemicals for yourself is your single largest exposure to PFAS is from PFAS in drinking water. So drinking it is your main concern, or at least that's what I used to tell everybody. And I can't advance it. So, so I wanted to tell you that we've changed that just a tiny bit, and that fish may actually be, if you eat a lot of fish, your highest exposure. And I wanted to just throw this up here to tell you that the US EPA did a Great Lakes human health fish tissue study, and also the US EPA did a national rivers and streams assessment. And you can kind of see these dots that are everywhere. So the lighter colored dots have lower concentrations of PFAS in the fish tissue. So if you look at the bottom, there are 8 like yellow dots, and then there are 219 kind of little light orange dots that have concentrations between 1,000 and 10,000. And then you'll notice that a bunch of them are darker. So you can find West Virginia here, and you can kind of see that most of them are darker. And what does that mean to you? So if you eat a 1 ounce serving and you have 1,000 nanograms per kilogram PFAS. Now there's a difference between PFAS, which is all chemicals that are perfluorinated or polyfluorinated, versus PFAS, which is just one kind. So this was the light yellow dots where there weren't very many of them. If you have that, it's like consuming an entire month of drinking water that has a concentration of 6 parts per trillion. And you might have caught from Dusty's presentation that the US EPA has a proposed maximum contaminant level, which just means how much you should drink without health effects, of 4 parts per trillion for PFAS right now out. And they're expected to be releasing those this spring as final numbers. So if you eat 1 serving with this concentration, it's like drinking 1 month of drinking water at 6 parts per trillion, which will exceed that proposed drinking water standard. But then there's this next number down here that says eating 1 8-ounce serving of 8,410 nanograms per kilogram of PFAS is like consuming 1 month of drinking water at 48 parts per trillion of PFAS. So the moral of this story is, if you're eating fish and it's coming out of our rivers, which appear to be very contaminated with PFAS, you're going to be eating a whole lot more PFAS than you ever knew. So the bottom right-hand corner just shows that in that fish tissue, that great big yellow is actually PFAS. So there's more PFAS than anything in fish. And then people always ask me, well, what kind of fish? Well, everything from salmon to walleye to catfish, bass, okay, things that fishermen like to go fishing for. So how do you know you have PFAS in your water? It doesn't have any odor, it doesn't taste, and it doesn't have any color. So you can't smell it, taste it, can't see it. And the only way you know it's there is to have somebody have tested for it. So if you get your water from a public water supply, every year they have to put out something, regardless of where you are in the United States, what's called a consumer confidence report. Okay. And in all public water supplies that serve more than 3,300 people are in the process of sampling for 29 different PFAS over either 2023, 2024, or 2025. So if you get your water from a public place and you want to know if it has PFAS in it, if they have tested, that data will be available either in the consumer confidence report. You can pick up the phone and call them, or if you want to look online, US EPA has a website that's for UCMR5. And if you can search by state and water system and see what their results were as well. But if you don't get your water from a public water supply, then you drink from a private well. Unless you have tested it, you won't know. So a lot of water systems are coming back with levels of PFAS that will most likely have to be treated for public water systems. I just got done taking a bunch of samples in private wells, and about half of them in an area which really didn't have a lot of known PFAS contamination before we started testing, have PFAS in them. So people are recommending that maybe you would like to put some type of filter on your water at the house, regardless of where your source is. So let's take a look at what's available to you that might take out PFAS. So either granular activated carbon or reverse osmosis are the two things that are most commonly used in a house in order to remove PFAS. And there are many different ways that you can have this, have something that would remove PFAS. So you can have on the left here and under the sink, you can have whole house, obviously more expensive, or you can have what you think of as pitchers. And so these pictures are from a study that was done by the Environmental Working Group that they did last summer. And they evaluated a bunch of different filters that you can just put your water in and treat it. So at the bottom of these, 100% removal of the tested PFAS for travel Berkey, 100% for zero water, 100% for clearly filtered, and 98% for the Epic water filter. So Berkeley was rated with the longest filter life. Zero water has the lowest initial cost. An honorable mention to clearly filtered and
Linda, you've frozen. It looks like Linda was saying that the Environmental Working Group gave Epic water filters a favorites vote for that filter. Linda, if you can hear us, can you, I don't know if you can try moving on to the next slide. We'll see if you can get unfrozen.
Looks like we may have lost Linda for the moment.
No, that's really a shame. Let's try moving on to Jill. And I just mentioned that Jill let us know that there were heavy storms moving through her area that may have affected Linda. And Jill has warned us that it sometimes leads to instability in her system too. But Jill, if we can get you to get started again, Jill is an activist and an organizer, and will be talking to us about how do we stand up for our rights for a healthy environment. Jill?
I can just say I'm happy right now because it's actually cleared up a bit. So I'm hoping I can make it through this. But thank you. And I'm honored to participate in this discussion on the impacts of fracking to frontline communities and to share my firsthand experiences with the possible PFAS contamination from the dangerous fracking process in West Virginia. First, I want to state that I consider myself a fracking refugee. I was forced from my home that I built with my own hands due to the fracking infrastructure that was built around my home, causing many disturbances, including negative health effects. In Appalachia, we have been living in a sacrifice zone for years due to the poorly regulated oil and gas industry. And we're not only dealing with negative health impacts, we also have unsafe roadways due to industry traffic, air and noise pollution, public and spring water contamination, pipeline explosions and well pad fires, one that resulted in the death of 70,000 fish and contaminated stream that leads to the mighty Ohio River. And also one of the largest methane leaks in US history occurred here that resulted in a horrible flaring incident after almost a month, and nearby residents were evacuated for a lengthy time. And looking at all the threats we face from this toxic industry, the waste continues to be a major source of contamination and concern. I have witnessed fracking waste facilities in West Virginia, Ohio, that have failed to manage and contain the waste, which is a likely source of PFAS contamination and radiological concerns. Clearwater in Doddridge County, West Virginia, was built by Denver-based Antero Resources and the affiliate Veolia, a multinational French wastewater and energy management company. The 225 million facility was designed to transform fracking waste into fresh water and food-grade salts. Imagine that. Proponents hailed that it was one of the most important environmental projects undertaken by the oil and gas industry in recent U.S. history. I was shown clear water by Mariana Barham, an inspiring environmental advocate who lived not far from the site. She welcomed me into her beautiful cottage in a hollow that I loved. It reminded me of my own home, in a hollow as well, and we both had lovely streams running through our properties. We also were negatively impacted by the industry. What I learned about Clearwater was very disturbing, including that it was built to process 600 truckloads per day of fracking wastewater, laden with heavy metals, PFAS chemicals, and other contaminants. This waste frequently exhibits levels of radioactivity, hundreds of times the safe limits set by regulators. Clearwater began operating in November of 2017, but 22 months later, the facility was idled, and Antero and Veolia were locked in a $500 million legal battle over the plant. In a court filing, Antero claimed that Veolia started cutting corners in the beginning of the project, hid vital design flaws, and made modifications that were ill-conceived, untested, and poorly implemented, and ultimately doomed the project. According to the complaint, the idling of the plant was because the facility simply didn't work. Such statements were very alarming and instilled fear in the local community, and rightly so. As reported by the Charleston Gazette-Mail, problems began in 2018 at the site when Antero noticed elevated chloride levels in the stormwater pond and found liquid had been escaping through the landfill. A month later, Antero section of the liner had been torn and was leaking. Based on the report the PSR released, it is possible that the fluids that leaked from that site contained PFAS chemicals. Certainly, there was no testing by the company or regulators to make such a determination. According to a West Virginia DEP incident report cited in the article, Antero didn't call the designated spill line, didn't tell the agency's Division of Water and Waste Management, didn't provide a written notice within 5 days of the incident and a plan to fix it, and didn't call the Hughes River Water Board, all actions it was to take. These companies do self-reporting and fail, as this example proves, to take the appropriate action or any action at all for that matter when any concern occur. Also, having 600 brine trucks a day hauling to Clearwater also possible contamination pathways. I have witnessed numerous times brine trucks leaking the contents onto roadways and even in parking lots. And on one such occasion, a very opportune time, I was taking the US EPA in their mobile monitoring vehicle to problematic fracking sites in the region. We were in a gas station parking lot when a brine truck pulled in and parked, and it was leaking this fracking wastewater right there in front of us. I was told by a brine truck driver that some operators instructed them to open the valves and release the fluid on roads where they wouldn't be detected. There have been documented incidents where along these same roads, the drivers had pulled over and dumped the entire contents of their loads into a stream. During conversation with industry workers, concerns were shared about pathways of contamination on frack pads. There are mats that are meant to cover and protect the area around the wellhead from spills and leaks. I was told that the mats are in poor condition with many rips and holes, and that they are frequently misplaced with patches of ground being exposed and the fracking fluids leaking around. I've seen the conditions of these mats as they are stored beside a major roadway about 100 yards from the campus of Union local K-12 schools and their school buses. Last year, on a recognizant mission with science investigative journalist Justin Noble, we were shocked to find high levels of radioactivity at an abandoned fracking waste processing facility in Fairmont, West Virginia. There had been an explosion at the site, and when our Geiger counter maxed out, making the most ominous noise, we were certainly horrified, terrified, and compelled to take action. We returned with the proper safety gear and were equipped to take soil and water samples. Further investigation of the site revealed several pathways of contamination where the remaining fluids that were stored on site had been leaking from the site. Our test results from Fairmont Brine confirmed what the Geiger counter seemed to reveal, that the site was radioactive and dangerous. Although we did not test for PFAS chemicals, based on this PSR report, they may be present and escaping and migrating to the Monongahela River directly below the site. There are also several home sites in the migration pathway. The site was obviously frequented by those looking for a place to hang out and party. There was graffiti, old furniture, beer cans, evidence of campfires, and even a pair of swimming trunks near the wastewater pond, where the liner was obviously compromised and leaking. A little closer to home, I will share that recently the Ohio Attorney General pursued legal action against Masters, a fracking waste processing facility located in Martins Ferry, Ohio, and very near the high school football field, 500 feet from the Ohio River and 1,000 feet from the city's drinking water wells. For a decade, I was joined by local and state advocates trying to shut down this dangerous facility. Consistently, there was a large brine puddle on the side of the road and right beside the garage doors that were always open of the facility where they were separating the liquid solid waste. We conducted soil testing, which showed elevated levels of radioactivity near the site. And once again, based on this report, if we would have been able to do PFAS testing, it probably is present as well. It's a huge victory and unprecedented for a conservative attorney general with strong industry ties to take legal action requesting a restraint the cease operations, the removal of all waste from the facility, and until all radiological safety protocols could be met. So I'm hopeful that the truth is finally coming to light and can't be ignored any longer. There is a large established network of environmental and community advocacy organizations like Physicians for Social Responsibility, who utilize their expertise and resources to expose the risks and uplift the voices of impacted communities on the front lines of oil and gas and petrochemical development. And so for this, I am so grateful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jill. I don't think I've ever met anybody before who called herself a fracking refugee, but you certainly made it very clear both what the dangers are from fracking and from fracking wastes, and also just what an inadequate job the industry does to take steps to protect us. Let me check in with Kevin. Has Linda Aller been able to return?
Sorry, I found my unmute button. Yes, she's back. Linda would, hi, Linda. If you'd like to share your screen again, we can have you finish your presentation. Hope everything's okay on your end.
We just lost our internet and I can't fix that. So I'm tied to my phone right now. We'll see how this works. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah,
Okay,
no
I'm going to screen share again. Yeah, there, yeah.
I just
Okay,
made you a co-host, so you should be able to share again.
okay.
Yep.
There we go. Okay, so I think probably when I froze, although I'm not 100% sure when, I was trying to explain to people that if you are interested in treating your water, you need to calculate the whole cost of how often you need to change your filters, because it's important that you look at both things. So how do you know a filter will remove your PFAS? So actually, I should be one back up. Nope. Okay. So not all GACs or ROs will take out PFAS. So it's important to look for units that are certified to remove PFAS. So the National Certification Foundation, as well as the American National Standards Institute, has two different standards. One is standard 53, and that's for carbon, and then standard 58 is for reverse osmosis. So if you buy a filter that has one of those standards that they say they are meet, then they will take out the PFAS. So it's important that not all people send theirs. In order to get them certified, it costs a lot of money. You have to send your unit to the testing agency, and they have to test. And so if you don't have this, you don't have any guarantee that it will work. And indeed, there have been some studies out there that say a lot of them that aren't certified don't work. So false sense of security. But the most important thing that you have to remember is maintenance. If you don't change the carbon or the membranes, it actually will build up and you can make it worse. So you'll get concentrated slugs of PFAS. And so if you are one of those people that don't like to maintain whatever equipment, then I suggest that you don't go down that road. Okay, so there are other ways to reduce your exposure to PFAS. So what do we know about where it is? Well, it's in almost all food packaging. So you should skip eating microwave popcorn. Microwave popcorn, there was a study that if you ate it every day for a year, you increase the concentrations of PFAS in your blood by 69%. You should limit using things that are in fast food containers or pizza boxes. All these wonderful properties of grease stain resistant things all have PFAS in them. But the good news is the Food and Drug Administration, which controls like wrappers for McDonald's and pizza boxes and microwave popcorn bags, have just passed legislation that say these things are going to be coming out of consumer articles by the end of 2025 if everybody makes those deadlines. So if you can avoid using some of these things for a couple years, in theory, your problem will be gone. Unless you think about the 15,000 different chemicals that we could use for replacement. So cookware, I'm sure everybody's heard not to use Teflon pans. Instead, use stainless steel, cast iron, glass. And then just be careful. Non-stick cookware, which of course we all love, particularly for eggs. If it's advertised as PFOA free, that's not the same thing as PFAS free. So if it used to be made with PFOA and now they decided to make it with PFBS or PTFE, they could still advertise as PFOA free. Okay, and it would still have harmful PFAS in it that you wouldn't like to have in your food. Clothing and textiles, avoid stain-proof treatments unless there's some now that are starting to be PFAS free. But in the old days when we all Scotch guarded everything, or every time you had your carpet cleaned, you wanted that stain resistant stuff put back on. Those are the things that have PFAS in them. Beware of water repellent and stain-proof fabrics. So I think the thing that I hated most was Gore-Tex. Okay, I love my Gore-Tex fabric. Everybody loves raincoats that breathe. Most of them have water repellent PFAS in them. And some of the larger manufacturers have started to take PFAS out of their raincoats and their outdoor gear that we all use. But not all of them are out yet. And it's really hard to distinguish that. So just kind of try to limit your exposure to some of those things. And then if you're a person that doesn't like to clean your house, this will motivate you, because one of the big sources of PFAS into you is dust in your house. So it comes off your clothes, it comes off your carpets, it comes off of your rugs, it comes from a lot of places. And those dust bunnies, those are actually harmful. You can get them both through ingestion, where like if you have little kids or pets that crawl on the floor, but you can also breathe them. And that actually, dust is one of the big exposures for firefighters in houses, and all their gear is made with PFAS too as well. So those are some of the ways that you can limit. And then I thought I would just put this up here as the end. So if you wanted to save some money, because toilet paper is expensive, then here's 57 pounds of toilet paper per year. These are actually from studies. Who uses 57 pounds of toilet paper per year? So there are 332 million people in the United States. They each use 57 pounds of toilet paper. You can see that's like a big, big, big number for pounds per year of toilet paper. We flush it down the toilet. It goes to a wastewater treatment plant. Wastewater treatment plants do nothing to treat PFAS. So they just go straight through. And it comes up in your sewage sludge, which then farmers place on fields. And it also then is taken downstream to the next major city that pulls water out of a river, and you can drink it again. So if you want an opportunity to help the environment, reduce your toilet paper usage. So, and I think I'll end there. And stop screen sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. That was such a practical presentation on ways that we can, I mean, first of all, starting with going back to the the earlier part of your presentation, I didn't even put two and two together to realize that, of course, there's PFAS in fish if they're in contaminated waters. And then, as you were just saying, PFAS in so many other chemicals and consumer products in our own lives. We're going to move on in just a moment to our last speaker, Jenna Dodson from West Virginia Rivers. But before we do that, I just want to note it's about 10 minutes to 1. We're running a little short on time, and there are so many very interesting and insightful questions in the chat. Halt the Harm Network has very kindly offered to let this webinar run beyond our scheduled time, so that we'll try to cram in some more time for the questions. And so I invite all of our participants and our speakers, if you can, to stay on the webinar a little bit longer, and we'll try to get to your questions. Our final speaker, as I said, is Jenna Dodson. Without further ado, take it away, Jenna.
Great, thank you so much, Barb. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me today. And thank you to PSR for publishing this important report for West Virginia. As Barb stated, my name is Jenna Dodson. I'm the staff scientist at West Virginia Rivers Coalition. And today I'll just provide a brief overview of recently passed PFAS legislation in West Virginia, where we are in terms of implementation of that legislation, and then what policy changes we're advocating for moving forward in light of this report. So really the impetus of the need for PFAS legislation in West Virginia came from that USGS source water study that Dusty actually showed in his presentation. So that study was released in 2022 and documented concerning levels of PFAS in source water for about half of our public water systems in West Virginia. So for those who are unfamiliar with the term source water, what we're talking about is it's also called the raw water or untreated water prior to treatment within a water treatment plant. So this documented widespread contamination really catalyzed the need for policy change to help address this public threat. So West Virginia Rivers worked hard with our partners and with community members across the state to advocate for a piece of legislation to help address this contamination. So in 2023, the West Virginia legislature passed the PFAS Protection Act. And the PFAS Protection Act has 3 main components. The first is related to water quality criteria for PFAS. So EPA hasn't finalized the recommended water quality criteria under the Clean Water Act for PFAS yet. However, when they do, the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, also known as DEP, is required to propose the adoption of those criteria to our state legislature. So the second component of the PFAS Protection Act is that it requires facilities that manufacture or knowingly use or have used certain PFAS chemicals in their production processes since 2017 to report that usage to the state DEP. And that would set in motion monitoring requirements on DEP's part to identify whether those facilities are sources of PFAS into the environment. And then the last main component of the PFAS Protection Act is that it requires DEP to write what we're calling PFAS action plans for each impacted public water system to identify and address the sources of PFAS pollution. So these action plans, as I said, are going to try and identify where the PFAS are coming from and provide recommendations on how to address those sources. So we recognize that that sounds great in theory, and also that it's a difficult challenge, particularly in light of many of the loopholes that have been and will be discussed today. However, we believe it is a step in the right direction to prevent further PFAS contamination and to hold polluters accountable. So that's the overview of the legislation. However, as we all know, passing legislation is just one step of a long multi-step process. And so the next step in our process is implementation of the PFAS Protection Act. So unfortunately, this was an unfunded mandate, so there was no money allocated to support these efforts. However, West Virginia Rivers and the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection applied for and received an EPA Environmental Justice Government to Government grant to help support the development of those PFAS action plans that I mentioned. And the idea is that we'll develop site-specific PFAS action plans that are going to be community-centered with local knowledge both guiding the process and also incorporated into the action plan so that it meets the needs of the community. Another thing that West Virginia Rivers did was create kind of a blueprint for DEP and for community members to help support the development of the PFAS action plans. And that blueprint includes recommendations for identifying PFAS sources, addressing PFAS sources, as well as some initial policy recommendations. That was just put into the chat if you'd like to take a look at that blueprint. And now moving forward, and in light of the report by PSR, it's clear that there are policy gaps still and more work is needed. So the PSR report demonstrates the use of PFAS in the oil and gas industry in West Virginia. And however, the oil and gas industry are not included in that group of facilities that are required to self-report under the PFAS Protection Act. So that is already a policy gap as far as PFAS reporting and a loophole that needs to be closed. Furthermore, these trade secrets within the oil and gas industry ignore the dangerous nature of cumulative impacts on already overburdened communities. So if we don't know where the PFAS are and how they've been used, we cannot start to address these cumulative burdens and can't keep communities safe. So West Virginia Rivers is calling for full transparency of PFAS use in the oil and gas industry. We need transparency about where PFAS are being used and meaningful policies to be put in place to prevent additional contamination so there are no more fracking refugees. So West Virginia Rivers currently has a petition open that calls for several different things. One, as I mentioned, is transparency in the oil and gas industry. The second, reporting of PFAS uses from oil and gas companies. Also, the reduction of PFAS use within the oil and gas industry. Holding responsible parties within the industry accountable for cleanup, closing loopholes in West Virginia's regulatory framework as it relates to PFAS in the oil and gas sector, and then advocating for enhancements to the PFAS Protection Act that can help achieve the above goals. So that petition was just dropped in the chat if you would like to take a look at that and sign on. And we really encourage you to do that and join us in pushing our leaders to advocate for transparency and accountability in the oil and gas industry to prevent PFAS contamination in water supplies and to protect public health. And if you're interested in getting updates from West Virginia Rivers as well, I encourage you to sign up for our email list. Kevin will drop a link to sign up for that in the chat as well. And then Jill, all of the speakers provided really wonderful presentations. We have compiled some helpful resources for folks who want to learn more about how to reduce their PFAS exposure in drinking water. So those links are going to be dropped in the chat too. And with that, I want to say thank you all so much for your attention this afternoon. I realize that it's just about 1 o'clock, and I'm happy to stay on and answer questions.
Well, thank you so much, Jenna. It's so good to hear that there's legislation available and work on implementation happening in West Virginia. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. It is just about the top of the hour. For those of you who have to leave, thank you very much for being here. But we will continue. Thanks again to Halt the Harm Network for extending the available time to us. Kevin, if we begin to overrun the available time, you just let me know. We have, as I mentioned, a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to start off with the first one. It says, is the PTFE in the form of plastic or dust, or is it in a solution? And what is the mechanism of potential groundwater contamination for PTFE in particular? So I believe that this one, and I'm going to answer this myself, taking that liberty as a co-author of the report. I believe we're talking here about within the drilling and fracking operations. So the PTFE, along with all the other chemicals used in fracking, are mixed with those millions of gallons of water that Dusty referenced at the beginning that are forced at high pressure down into the wells. So it goes down in that liquid form. And then at the same time, we should remember that a lot of that wastewater comes back up to the surface and sometimes is stored in open ponds. And there is the potential for, as the edges of those storage ponds tend to dry out, some of the chemicals that are there do become airborne as the water dries away. And then what is the mechanism of potential groundwater contamination for PTFE in particular? I'm not aware that that there's any other mechanism for groundwater contamination other than the ones that Dusty outlined at the beginning. And if you'll remember, that started with the drilling process. When the drills first go down through the earth, they can go right through those bands of groundwater and contaminate them. And then with the breakage or leakage in the drilling shaft, and then of course in the wastewater. So there are many. They are not particular to PTFE. It's a package deal, and it's not a very good deal. Let me move on to our next questions. This one might be for you, Linda. It says, can water filter systems contain PFAS? And I think that might be interesting to answer. I mean, there is the question of what happens to the sludge in your home pitcher, but also I guess we could ask what happens at the wastewater treatment plants if they're removing PFAS, if they're able to. What do they do with it?
So wastewater treatment plants do not remove PFAS. So they simply actually, if you take tests, sometimes they actually increase PFAS once they go through the process. And that's just because they break the different polyfluorinated chemicals break down into the more stable perfluorinated chemicals. So I'm not sure I have a direct answer to the question as it was proposed. There are things that could take it out of wastewater. Obviously, we put a lot of wastewater down the systems, and there's a lot of scientific effort to figure out how to get PFAS out of our water, out of our soils, and it will come, but it is not here yet.
Thank you. Another question is, if you're on well water, how often do you need to have your well water tested?
So part of that will depend on what the hydrogeology is, but I have done enough testing in private wells to tell you that in general, as long as you're still using your well, and it depends on where the source is coming from, but in general, once you know it's there, we haven't seen a lot of decrease in concentrations. And I really, in all honesty, haven't seen a lot of additional wells that got PFAS later when we went out and retested, but it depends entirely upon where the source is and what the hydrogeology is.
Okay, makes sense. Jill, this might be one for you. I'm not really sure. It was just posted as a comment, but let me pose it as a question. I wonder if milk products and beef are routinely tested for PFAS. We learned about the PFAS extending into fish. Here's another kind of speculative question about just how far and how fast do these forever chemicals go in our food system? Jill,
Well,
or anybody else?
I have to be perfectly honest. I immediately remember Terry Greenwood, who was from Washington County, Pennsylvania, a neighbor I consider an hour from here. And he, in his story, greatly influenced my activation and years ago, just knowing I had to get involved. But he had a frack pad built near his farm. There was a leak that contaminated his pond. And first his cows got sick and they died. And then he developed the glioblastoma, the rare form of brain cancer that, there's some correlation between exposure to fracking and chemicals. And so that's a big concern, even with the compressor stations. Absolutely. I think the livestock that are, raised in the shale fields certainly should be tested and could definitely, have PFAS contamination as well as many others. So thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, we at Physicians for Social Responsibility are always very careful and cautious about talking about causation. And I noticed that Jill, you very carefully made that same distinction, but these are definitely areas of concern where we see associations between an exposure and an outcome. We may not be able to tell or prove causation, but we see what's going on. So
Can I add something?
please.
So there is no routine testing for milk products or beef in our system. The best example of milk was a farmer in Maine who actually eventually led to the ban of biosolids in Maine. He was like a third generation milk farmer, dairy farmer, and for some reason, and I'm not quite sure why, he had his milk tested for PFAS, and it had exorbitant amounts of PFAS in it. Once you have contaminated milk, you can't sell it. So Department of Ag says it's adulterated and you have to dump. And he found out that he had applied biosolids legally on fields. And the last time he applied was like 1984 or 5. And those biosolids had excessively high levels of PFAS. And he eventually had to get rid of all of his cows. He lost his ability to produce milk. And a lot of places have not been testing milk and or beef because they don't want to know the answers. But it's in deer meat, it's in beef, it's in milk. If there is a source, so just, I'm sorry, but we're not testing.
Right, as if that were to keep us safe.
Correct.
Here's a question. Should we avoid the clothing? This, I think, is clothing that might contain PFAS, for example, as a water repellent. Should we avoid the clothing due to production risks in the factory area, or is it absorbed through the skin?
You want me to answer that one too?
Whoever can take a shot at it, please.
Somebody else? Okay. So it has been found that it will cross the skin barrier. There aren't a lot of good scientific information about how much crosses the skin barrier. And for a long time, everybody just said, no, it didn't. But there were a lot of studies that were run like for children that, chew on their clothes or chew on a blanket or things like that, that it will increase. You can eat it. You can, and when you wash your clothes, it does come off your clothes, like into your wash water. So yes, it's both a factory, person working in a factory problem, but as consumers, yes, we are all exposed. And remember, it's going to shed dust. And once the dust is in your house, it becomes, picked up and eaten by little kids, as their sticky fingers. But it also goes airborne, and then you become exposed through the air.
Thank you for that. There are more questions about these pathways to exposure. I think it's evident from the questions that there is just a very high level of concern about these highly toxic, forever lasting chemicals. So let me combine two. There was an earlier question about what about refrigerator waters? If you have cold, the cold water dispensers in your refrigerator, is that water filtered, and does that filter out PFAS? But also, here's another one. How do I dispose of used water pitcher filters?
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. First of all, your media in your refrigerator or in your ice maker is usually carbon based. Okay, so as long as you replace your carbon filter, when the light comes on, sometimes we all get lazy or they're expensive, so we don't want to, replace them. You should replace them because you want to take that stuff out. And if you don't replace your filter, it also is the perfect place for bacteria to grow, and bacteria make you sick immediately. So And then you asked about disposal. So there are a couple things. There's a proposal to name several PFAS as hazardous materials. And then you will still be allowed to put them in your trash and take them out as a consumer, but you will not be allowed to do that if you are a company. Like, we dump, all kinds of cleaners, into our trash. Or but most places you should, if those laws pass, then you should treat them as hazardous chemicals, because now you have the PFAS, which is going to be a hazardous chemical in your carbon. The downside to using an RO unit, if you're on a septic tank, is that your RO unit pulls out your PFAS and it concentrates it, and then it disposes of it. And your disposal mechanism then is into your septic tank, which then infiltrates the water. And your well is usually fairly close by. And so eventually you keep recontaminating your land, as opposed to using RO in a city where it goes to the wastewater treatment plant and becomes a different problem. But that's not true for carbon. For carbon, it actually pulls it out. It's attached in the carbon. And so it doesn't like recontaminate your land if you use carbon and you're on a private water system.
Thank you. I do want to mention that I believe 2 people asked whether the recording of this very informative session today is going to be made available. And the answer is, thanks to the Halt the Harm network, yes, it will. Kevin let us know that the recording will be made available. I presume that means to everybody who's on today and to those who registered and who perhaps weren't available to be with us. I'd also like to mention that there's a huge number of really, really interesting comments in the chat, both for people with observations to share, people engaged in activism, and people looking for help. So I hope you've had a chance to follow those. We're just about out of questions, and we are just about out of time. So I'm going to take the chair's privilege and ask Dusty Dusty Horwood, if you could jump on and just give us a few of the final recommendations that PSR is making for what we can do to, since there's not much that we can really do to protect ourselves from PFAS, what can we do to prevent future harm from PFAS contamination? You want to give us just a few highlights of those, Dusty, and we'll round out our presentation with that.
Sure, thanks, Barb. Yeah, 3 of the recommendations are to have full disclosure of chemicals used in oil and gas wells. And that's similar to what Jenna and West Virginia Rivers is asking for in West Virginia, to prohibit the use of PFAS in oil and gas wells, and to ensure that oil and gas waste is treated as hazardous waste, because it is. Unfortunately, under the federal hazardous waste law, oil and gas waste is exempt. States do have the power to close that loophole. New York State has taken that step, and West Virginia could too. I want to also quickly say that in 2022, the state of Colorado enacted legislation that requires full chemical disclosure in oil and gas wells, without the ability for companies to hide individual chemicals behind trade secret claims. Their legislation covers all chemicals going into the wells, not just fracking chemicals, but also drilling chemicals. And it requires disclosure from the chemical manufacturers, who are the companies in the best position to know what chemicals are being used in oil and gas wells. It's a good piece of legislation. We are working with groups in Colorado to help implement that legislation. The state has been dragging its feet on implementation. That legislation in Colorado was the result of years of work by activists who previously had reformed the state's oil and gas rules. And it shows both that it is difficult to take on the industry and it takes time and effort to make progress, but also that if enough people come together and put in the time and effort, that progress is possible. And we hope we can see that in West Virginia as well.
Well, thank you very much for Dusty. A very positive and hopeful note to end on. We'll wrap up our webinar now. I'll remind you that the PSR report is available at www.psr.org. And don't forget that West Virginia residents are encouraged to take a look at and sign the petition that was put into the chat by West Virginia Rivers. So thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. This was just fascinating. And of course, thanks once again to Halt the Harm Network for hosting us. Thank you very much, everybody, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.